So my name is Stephen Thomforde. I work with Stantec Consulting Inc. right now. And I've been involved in ecological restoration for many years. And I want to take one moment to really thank Pollinator Friendly Alliance for doing the work and hosting these programs and these events. I'm always honored to be part of their program. So tomorrow I'm talking about oak savannas, and today I'm just going to quickly go over some of the ideas I have about fire in our ecosystems. And I really think we need more of a discussion in fire. And so a lot of the object of this presentation is just to get us thinking about fire. And tomorrow too, I guess a lot of the object of that will be thinking about savannas a little bit differently than we currently do. So the title of my presentation is going to be Restoring Historic Fire Regimes to Increase Biodiversity, Ecological Integrity, and that literally means connections, food webs, energy flows, nutrient cycles. So that's what I mean by integrity. And that high integrity nutrient flows, energy flows, provides ecosystem services. I mean, that's what purifies our water and builds our soils, are those incredible, that integrity between all those different, that food web, and all those chemicals and nutrients flowing through it in ways that the ecosystem has selected for it. So kind of a cool concept. Mr. Odom told me about that. Anyways, I just wanted to show you this slide right here. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I have not read Braiding Sweetgrass. I've heard a lot of people say you have to read that. She actually came from my lab in medicine before I was there, but we always considered ourselves the lab of the misfits. So I think Robin would fit in that category. This is a really nice little paper. I think it was written in 2000. And the nice thing is she's got a very succinct reference section too. And that reference section really plugs into some real big time people with indigenous knowledge about how the Native Americans employed fire. And so just reading this made me think about, well, yeah, these people did this for thousands and thousands and thousands of years to maximize ecosystem integrity. What are we doing? So anyways, so that's why I'm kind of really thinking about, can we restore those historic fire regimes? Okay, my family farm, I've been burning for, I don't know, since, oh my gosh, the late 1990s. I used to burn by myself, kind of like Kung Fu, because I thought if I could teach myself how to burn landscapes like this by myself, I'd really get good at it. And I did, I can do it. I can do it well. Let's put it that way. It would take me hours to burn sometimes an acre, but it was just kind of interesting. And of course, now I lead our crews at Stantec because of my experience and training, etc. So I still get out and do it all the time. So there's a lot of questions right now about burning, especially in the pollinator community. About 2013, when we were coming up with the best management practices, we were looking at what we should or should not be doing to promote, or what we should be doing to promote pollinator habitat, pollinator populations. And one of the things was fire, and how fire might impact a lot of invertebrates, for that, and a lot of different animal species. And so is fire good or bad? I guess really came out of that discussion. And I just put rare species up there, which would be pollinators in this case. It could be frogs, could be a lot of different things. And carbon in the atmosphere, two of the things that we're talking about with fire regimes here. But I'm going to take one moment to talk about the principle of counterintuitiveness. It's really not a principle. I've made it up myself, but I like it a lot, and it works. And somebody's got to make it into some type of law or something like that. But it is one of the foundations of complexity. And basically, the principle of counterintuitiveness, what makes sense at one scale in time or space, becomes the exact opposite at a higher level of analysis, a larger amount of time or a larger space. It's the exact opposite. And C.S. Hawley knew this, the guy that gave us resilience and so much more. But he would say that we would impose a management regime like fire or no fire, and then that would become the default regime for generation after generation after generation. All of a sudden, surprise, Smokey the Bear situation, forest would catch on fire and just completely disintegrate. And so he said we have to be aware what makes sense at one level of analysis can be the exact opposite and different, and we can't predict. Okay. And he would smile and say, we just can't predict, but we have to be adaptive. And that's the whole concept that he brought about. Adaptive management is basically built on that. We have to be adapted. And that's C.S. Hollings, also what he brought to us, adaptive management. So we can't make these predictions. So think about anything that we say or list, 1 quart per acre will kill this weed. And 20 years later, the weed has developed immune system, and we can't kill that same weed with that same herbicide at 1 quart per acre anymore. Complexity, when you're dealing with ecosystems, not just a lot of parts, it's evolving. It's changing over time. So even if we could hold the parts in real stability, they're going to change over time. So that's complexity in the ecosystem makes it so difficult. Here's a great example of something that I've always really scratched my head on. But this is a rain garden and best management practice of how are we going to keep the weeds down? It's like, well, let's just add mulch. And so I think people in the audience may have been involved, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 inches of mulch, and it's usually hardwood mulch. It's been grounded, and it works great. It makes perfect sense. It's going to keep the weeds down until the mulch decomposes. Drip, 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 slow variables, and you hit a threshold, and the nitrogen shoots up, and all of a sudden you're covered with thistles and giant ragweed and burning nettles and burdock and right on down the line. And what do? We add more mulch. So completely, look at the burdock off to the side of that picture there. So anyways, so that's, if you have a pile of mulch like this someplace, and it's been sitting there for 5, 10, 15 years, and notice the weeds growing around that. So anyways, that's the principle of counterintuitive. So let's go back to fire and think about it. And I really want you to think about that in any of your management decisions you make as you move forward. It's like, well, this makes sense now, but let's keep a close eye on it because it could change fast. So, we're talking about fire frequency, pollinators, carbon, every year, every 3 years, every 7 years, or never. And the current trend has been kind of towards less fire. So I'm not going to make a suggestion one way or another, because I think you should know right now, I'm not a command and control type of person. Like, this is the way it should be done once every 3 years. It's going to be very dynamic. And I think at the end of this presentation, by using this indigenous knowledge, it's going to be like, oh my gosh, there's so many different ways that we should be employing fire. Creative, intelligent design has to rule, and be dynamic and flexible at the same time. I'm just thinking about fire. We've been down this road once before. Less and less fire kind of sometimes results in, catastrophe type situation. So we do know from the literature that fires have been, multiple ecosystems have suffered decline currently in biological diversity. And some of them actually disappeared completely in the absence of fire. And these include native grasslands, oak savanna, aspen parklands, wetlands, pine groves, openings, barrens, chaparrals, and balds. And here's a project in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, right here in the picture, where it was just chock full of, the worst noxious weeds in the world. I will not use the term invasive. Undesirable species, things like buckthorn. And so we've cleared that out, and now we're going to manage this for an aspen parkland again, and we will use fire as part of that. Just kind of a burn through a oak savanna in the summertime, and we had some dry fuels to work on it. So the question of is fire good or bad? Maybe we should replace it by, is the way we do fire good or bad? So it's not fire that's good or bad, but how we do it should be really discussed. It's I'm a farmer and I grow corn, and corn is evil on our land, but it's really not the corn that's evil. It's the way we do corn. When you think about it, corn is a native grass. It's a native C4 grass, as a matter of fact. It's been grown by Native Americans for 11,000 years in North America. It's not corn that's bad, it's the way we do it. And so I'm trying to apply that same principle to burning. So let's take some assumptions, and we're going to explore fire and its importance in the landscape. And we're going to look at some indigenous knowledge on how they employ fire. So let's just have some fires or some assumptions here. First of all, we're going to assume that fire has been an intricate disturbance in our ecosystems for a long time. Okay. We're also going to assume that our historic ecosystems, our restoration targets, represent kind of the ultimate functional, productive, diverse, provisional ecosystem allowed at that site under the various constraints for that site. So we're just, that's why we have it as a target. Oh, that's the ultimate ecosystem. Very diverse. It provided a lot of ecosystem service. That's what we want to restore. Okay. So how can we restore historic fire regimes that reinforce these high levels of ecosystem integrity, function, production of ecosystem services, and diversity? How can we restore those? So let's examine the past to help us design the future. It's kind of where we're going. Okay. But I'm going to take a quick caveat, and I'm going to back up into we are very fire centric in our management, and we have to realize that the vegetation that we desire to restore, savannas and grasslands, they're kind of the same. We'll talk about that tomorrow. They are the same. They are the same. But savannas and grasslands, the default, they're very obligated to biomass harvest. We need to harvest the biomass in order to get the chemicals, the nutrients out of it, and the energy to flow through food webs. So all this other diversity of animals and plants can share in this energy and these nutrients. So we have to harvest the biomass. Super important. Without that, we just trap it in the first trophic level. The nutrients build up, the system floods out, it becomes eutrophic. The undesirable plant species move in, take over the site, and you're in a catastrophic situation. So biomass harvest is critical. So fire does that role, but it's not the default mechanism. Grazing was. Grazing has been the default biomass harvest mechanism for the past 30 million years with this vegetation. We'll kind of touch base a little bit more on that tomorrow, but some way or another, we need to harvest. We need to transition those beautiful plants, those super high quality plants, into animal tissue, whether it's an arthropod, an insect, or an annelid, a worm, or a vertebrate animal such as a frog or a buffalo or a cow. We need to transition that. So it's very critical that we move biomass harvest. Fire is not the default. We really need to be thinking about restoring or mimicking large animals on our landscape again. Okay. So there you go, just kind of taking a look at one of our analogs that we actually have is Africa. Cool picture, isn't it? There are some grassland restoration specialists around the global scale who really suggest that even in North America here, before pre-human periods, which could have been 14,000 years ago or less, or before the gun and the trap was here in North America, that like Africa, the herbivores would consume so much vegetation that fire was very, very unlikely. Lightning caused ignition of fire just didn't happen that much because the herbivore intensity was so great that there wasn't dry vegetation sitting around. I've heard some people from Africa that study Serengeti said to see a seed head on grass is rare. Picture your big blue stem prairies full of all those seed heads in the fall. Picture that not happening if we had historic population. So that's really interesting. Very non-flammable atmosphere like that. 60 million bison. So another thing we need to think about when we're talking about fire too, I'm not going to talk about abiotic fire. I'm talking about human-driven fire. And there's a line here through the North America, basically United States of America here in Mexico. And that's about at the 100th meridian or the 98th meridian in this case. And any vegetation or any fire on the east side of that was most likely human driven, unless you're in like the sand plains someplace, the Precambrian shield up in the Boundary Waters, or sandy fields like in Wisconsin, stuff like that, the Kankakee sand dunes out in Indiana. Those could have been created by lightning, but more than likely these were human driven, okay? Abiotic fire, lightning installed was basically to the west side. What's interesting about it, when you start talking about human driven fire, there's objectives. I mean, they weren't just out there just like, with their Bic lighter and it's like, hey, let's start a fire. They were figuring out why we're going to burn. And it wasn't because we're getting paid to do this fire, where it's the third year in the 3-year cycle, and it says we burn every 3 years. They're thinking about why they're burning that site with much deeper objectives than what we are, which is really interesting to think about. And out west, when lightning hits a tree, it's more random. There's no objectives to it. And in biological systems, nothing's really random. So I think we're looking, because if we're making the decisions when to burn, what to burn, why to burn, we need to be thinking about these, and we need a greater set of objectives. And oh, it's every 3 to 5 years we burn. Check that off the box when we do it. Fire has been part of the Earth continent, or the planet Earth, for ever since plants moved onto land 400 million years ago in the Devonian period. There's actually charcoal fragments in fossils that they find. Evidence suggests that humans in Africa have employed fire for 800,000 years. Amazing to think about that. Look at that fire crew right there. You know, I don't know, fire crews. I just spent $800 yesterday on 3 pairs of Nomex trousers because my crew said their trousers weren't fitting them correctly. And then I look at this picture here. I'm just like, they're not even, anyways, I'm not even going to go down that road. In Europe, it suggests that people have been using fire on the landscape for 300,000 years. And here in North America, depending on when we got here, again, nice fire crew, right? You know, 14,000, 9,000 years, people have been using fire. And it's really different from the way we use fire today. These are some pictures from some of our crews and some of our teams out doing the work of fires. A lot of equipment, really expensive. I know that I've worked for several restoration companies, and we've always complained we don't get paid. We literally lose money doing fire the way we do it. And this is one of the reasons why so much people that we deploy, so much equipment we deploy, and we don't make money burning fires. It's a service that we literally lose money on. And so even as a service provider right now, we're trying to get it where fire becomes more of an intelligent design, and then we can charge the appropriate price. And possibly, if we do it right, fire will become less intense. And therefore, we don't have to employ as much of equipment or as many resources to do the fire properly. So that would be the ultimate goal, that we actually profit from using fire as a service provider. And one of the reasons why is because fire is less intense and we don't have to employ as many resources. Okay. Command and control and the pathology of natural resource management. Classic paper by Mr. C.S. Holling, if you ever get a chance, 1996. And we are working, setting some fire. So these are our current goals that we generally work with. And these are expectations. And we don't necessarily set these expectations. It's just in our group, our people, the land managers that contract with us set a lot of these expectations too. And we have to get away from these expectations if we're going to continue to use fire. And one of the goals is that we really want to see 90 to 100% of that landscape charred. And I've walked away from fires before where we're looking at it and we're saying, can we send the guy the invoice? You know, it's like we didn't really accomplish the goals, you know, because there's patches all over. And a couple of years ago, I started to shift away from that, where literally as we were selling fires, we were saying, here's what I think we should do. We should burn less than 2/3 of your landscape, leaving 1/3 of it back. And there's 2 ways we can do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we could actually convince the land managers or the landowners to be proud of Apache fire. And that's the direction that we need to go. Our typical fire regimes come out every 3 to 5 years. And I think that that's based more on budgets and human resources than it is on ecological considerations. And like I said, it's really based on the scorched earth policy. One of the theories behind the 3 to 5 year regime is that we've saturated the amount of detritus and dead materials that are going to build up. After that, they start to decompose, so we need to burn it off every 3 to 5 years. So I think it's really driven more by budget than it is ecology. And it is imposed. You know, we literally burn on the days unless we're restricted by red flag warnings. We're not really thinking about it. And again, if you really think about it, and I've been burning a long time. What are my ecological objectives when I'm on even in my farm, in my burning? And I think we need to create this group of people listening today and other levels amongst yourself and your organizations. What are those ecological objectives we need to create as we go about burning? Okay, typically more and more we are saving pollinator habitat. We actually start, you know, this thing of the concept about we don't want to burn more than 2/3 of your landscape. We would go in and mow out huge areas, typically in circles, because there's less surface area there. So we did a 60-acre prairie down in Scott County just recently. And we literally took 27 acres out of that 50, 60 acres, and we just made it into 2 large circles, kind of random in the field. Not a bunch of them, but 2 giant large circles. And I don't know, maybe we should have done smaller ones and etc. Lots of stuff to talk about. So going back to the benefits of fire, we know that they maintain multiple biotic communities that we seek to restore, fire-dependent communities. We know that they promoted biodiversity. Greater flowers equals more animals, e.g. predators, or pollinators and predators. We know that it extended grassland ecosystems far beyond its spatial temporal dominant areas. There's a lot of areas where prairies existed that would not have been prairies if it wasn't for grazing animals and fire. It promotes long-term carbon sequestration. We'll talk about it right at the very end. And it really reduces a lot of pestilence and disease like biting mosquitoes and biting flies and viral bacterial epidemics and wood ticks too, or any type of tick, I should say. So what can we learn from the past to help us with the future? Okay, so this is just kind of a cool concept. And again, there's that line, the 98th meridian in this case. All the land on the east side of that line would have been forest, but it wasn't. And it's such a powerful statement. I heard somebody say that to me once, and I kind of like, yeah. And then I realized, oh my God, there were forces acting to hold that forest back. The river would have flowed, but we put a dam up. We captured all that water behind the dam. We didn't let it be forest. We didn't let it be a river. I'm not pro dam, by the way, but just for an example. And as we let the river through the dam, we made energy out of it. And so by holding an ecosystem in disequilibrium from becoming forest, going into this climax, when we hold it in early, mid-successional climate state, we actually get a lot more work out of that ecosystem. So to think of the power in that line and that arrow, forest this way, grass on that way, nothing really going on the grassland, but it's that other side, the east side of that line is so powerful as an ecosystem. Okay. So let's learn from the Native Americans. I love this quote. When the buffalo went away, nothing after happened. So anthropocentric fire, human fire, disappeared from the eastern forest by 1700s, okay, and from the west by 1900s. Even in New England, by the 1600s, fire was gone, and they used it as a form of imperialism. At first, the settlers, the very first in the 1600s, were like living in harmony with everybody. The indigenous cultures were there, but they got a little bit worried about fire, and then fire became a way you can't burn anymore. And it's like, well, what do you mean we can't burn anymore? We burn all the time. No, you can't burn anymore. It's dangerous. And that was some of the very first steps towards colonialism and literally putting constraints on these people that forced them to move. So when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them again. After this, nothing happened. So it's just kind of a powerful statement. Okay. Here's an outcome of a long-term eastern forest with no fire in it. You can see some of the lateral branches out there indicating this is a much more open ecosystem, grazing animals and fire maintained in that system. And when we diminished these two disturbance regimes, the system went into deep equilibrium and very low diversity, very low function. The soils are eroding. How much pollinator habitat is in that situation? You know, a mouse and a rabbit can't even live in that. So a lot of our areas that we even manage as parks or for nature are in this state right now. We'll touch more on this tomorrow in the Savannah talk. But this quote right here, the anomalous transitional landscape after the fires were removed, 1985. And I've often called a lot of these landscapes transitional states that we take as the original condition. And so it was nice to find something from 1985 calling them a transitional landscape. So they're a forested, dysfunctional, catastrophic states. Okay, so let's go in the past. One of my favorite reads is Thomas Morton, 1634. Yeah, 1634. This guy was made the governor of New York, although it was owned by the Dutch at the time, so it wasn't really New York. Plymouth, I guess, is the place it is. And so this is in the Library of Congress. You can pull it up, you can punch in words like medicinal plants, and it'll pull it up. All those little blue dots at the bottom of the screen. Every place that I punched in fire comes up. You can see it kind of highlighted in the purple there. So it's really kind of an incredible read from 1634. I remember in biology class in college, they said, Don't read any articles that are older than 10 years old. It's like, oh my God, here's something that's really old. And I think as ecologists, to see into the past, it really helps us with this. So anyways, Thomas Morton, just to summarize it, Native Americans set fire to all places twice a year. They eliminated the undergrowth. It made walking really easy. The fires burned day and night, trickling through the forest until the rain came and makes the land very park-like, beautiful, and provisional. So that's something to think about. So let's go out to the Pacific Northwest, 1792, George Vancouver. And this you can find it in Boyd, 1999. And again, just to summarize, he calls it a delightful view, spacious meadows, eloquently adorned with clumps of trees and oaks, 4 to 6 feet in diameter, if you read through the paper. Beautiful pastures, he calls them, great numbers of deer playing about, highly provisional land that could otherwise only be achieved with great labor back in Europe. So the Native Americans are using fire to achieve what only in Europe we could achieve with only great amounts of labor. Okay, here's Boyd again. He's quoting J. Miller, 1979. J. Miller is an anthropologist working with some Native Americans in the same areas 187 years after George Vancouver was on that landscape. And he's driving through that with a band of elders. And a woman in the back of the van just started crying. And he's like, he thought she was just nostalgia for seeing her homeland again. And finally, when she came to, she started sobbing. She said, literally, what's happened? We took such good care of this land. We burned every fall, every year. It looks so park-like, and now it looks like a jungle. Powerful. So that's 187 years after George Vancouver, very park-like, etc. So notes from Canadian Mounties in the 1920s. This I found in Lewis in 1988. So these are the Mounties, and they're in Manitoba, they're in Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan. They're interviewing these Native Americans about boreal forest burning. So again, now we're in the boreal forest, or the northern forest, coniferous mixed herbaceous woodlands. And the burns they burn in strategic locations, and they burn where it would most benefit the wildlife. So that's pretty cool. And some of the quotes these guys are giving, it's really kind of fun to read through them. They've got a great sense of humor. Moose love the burn areas, both summer and winter food. Our people argue who's going to hunt the moose in the area that we just burned, and because everyone wants to hunt where we've just burned, because they know that's going to be the perfect moose habitat. So it's just kind of funny to read through those. Mice and snowshoe hare like fresh vegetation from fire. Lynx and fox and wolf like snowshoe hare and mice, so they love fire too. Too much dead grass and no good for animals. So it was really interesting. One Native American was talking about, he watched a wolf for half an hour chasing mice and pouncing on them. And he said, I was laughing so hard, wolf heard me and ran away before I could get a shot at it. It was just kind of interesting. Again, this is in the 1920s that they're coming from. Burn strategic locations. In this case, they're creating lawns for their horses in the wintertime out there. So they would burn out areas in these boreal forest areas. And a lot of times they burn along lake shores. It was really easy to do. You had water on one side, snow would be back in the forest. So they're burning really early in the year when there's still snow on the ground. And then the muskrats loved it, the beaver loved it, and again, the moose really loved it too. UC Davis, great college. Never been out there before, but if you ever see papers come out of UC Davis, great instructors, great program at UC Davis. California's got an amazing university system going. But they're actually teaching Native American landscape management with fire at the class. I would have been good at that class. I probably would have gotten a name at that, actually. So anyways, pretty cool. Yeah, I like that. So again, more from the Royal Canadian Mounties. They burned at safe times. They talk about, we did not want to burn in the woods during times that the fire would carry. They only burn when fire was, they could literally start the fire and walk away from it. So that's really interesting. I'd like to do that myself. Before snow melt, and they created fresh vegetations for the ducks before the ducks returned to nest. And all animals like it. And again, just no burns, lots of dead stuff, not so many ducks or muskrats. So just kind of interesting. I've done this quite a bit. This is what I call snow burning. I was just out skiing on a lake in the metropolitan area in Minneapolis area the other day, And the whole north side of the lake was just completely free of snow and a nice tight swath. Could have gone over there with a match, lit the thing on fire and skied away, and let the whole fringe of that lake community, which would kill the overcrowding weeds, which get rid of the dead grass, which would promote calamagrostis, the sedges. And I've always thought, this is up in Ely, Minnesota, right here, that the Forest Service could be sending out people on dog sleds right now. Super intelligent design. Those guys can do 50 miles a day on these conditions. Just they wail with those dogs. Get out at these sites and burn this patch and off to the next, boom, 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 right up all these big lakes, and just burn off a lot of little teeny areas like this and not worry about the fire escaping into the woods. Kind of an interesting, call it snow burning. Okay. I love this story right here, and I'll show you a model of how this works and something that we could think about employing. So anyways, this comes from a gentleman who's living out there, Mr. Miller, in 1860. And he's living actually with some of the Native Americans, the Modocs, I think they're called, in that region up in the Sierra Nevada. And he said, in the early spring, the elder women, everyone else is out of camp doing something else. The elder women would see up in the mountains up there a patch where the snow had melted, and they'd climb up there and they'd burn that off. And about a week later, as the patch melted away further from the black area now, they would go up and burn it off again, and a week later again and again. So can you imagine, as this concentric circle melted and melted and melted, and they burned each patch, the different colors of greens and the different plant communities that would, mimic or overlay on those burn patches? Because if they do this year after year after year after year for thousands of years, that's pretty cool. Okay. Again, a snow burn up there. This way, Chuck Miller, he actually said, in this way, by doing it this way, the fire was never a servant. Or I'm sorry, the fire was always a servant. We were using the fire to help us and never the master. The fire didn't chase us away. So that's kind of a cool way to look at it. And he also said, by doing it, really intelligent design of fire this way is that, in this way, their forests were open, they were pure, they were fruitful, and they just conflagrations like ticks and biting flies, poisonous plants were just not known. So here's kind of the model I picture in that. It's a white mountain up there, using your imagination here a little bit. And that brown area up there represents where the sun has beat on the southwest slope, and it's opened up and snow all around it. And so the women would walk up there and start to on fire. It would be black, and bam, it would be nice and green with some flowers on it. Then it would expand in the melt zone. They'd start that on fire. It would be black. Now you've got different stages of green, different types of flowers. Burn back some a little bit more flowers, and so on and so forth. And so over a couple month period of time, you'd really, and if you did this over and over again, you could really kind of like sculpt different types of plant communities based on those fire frequencies in time. Okay, George Callan. Again, the art is such a powerful thing. We're literally seeing like a translation of what George Callan has seen on the prairie back from the 1830s type situation. So Native Americans burned for a lot of different reasons. Lewis and Anderson, 2006, they identify 70 different reasons that Native Americans burned, but the primary objectives for indigenous fire was food quest. And probably the number one was just creating grazing monster track herbivores. Number two may have been to drive game, but that's pretty iffy. And I've read some other papers, just like, you start a fire, you never know where the animals are going to go anyway. So that maybe doesn't make that much sense. It could have very specific, a buffalo here, cliff over there, you light the fire, but how often would that happen? To help them gather acorns and grasshoppers that are partially charred. They would burn off the grass there, the acorns are laying there, and they could pick those up. Enhance permacultures. I know Will Seeger, our Arctic explorer here from Minnesota, has talked about how the Native Americans would burn up in a lot of those large peninsulas surrounded by water on both sides, just to increase the blueberry production, raspberry production, strawberry production up in that area, and also swidden agriculture or shifting agriculture. Here's a gentleman out in Maine. He's a blueberry farmer, and he's employing these techniques that the Native Americans did to help enhance his organic blueberry farm operations in Maine. So that's a pretty cool concept. There were secondary objectives for burning too, like reducing pestilence, promoting fire safety. If you got to your village, your summertime area, you arrived there and it was full of just dead, very highly flammable material, you'd probably tell the family to stay back for a second in the canoe or whatever as you went up there, lit the site on fire, burned it off, and then you could set up your summer vacation there. And clearing corridors. It was really interesting to read about the Canadian fire that the people, especially in the boreal forest, they called it fire lawns and fire corridors. Their trails, they burned a lot. And a lot of times they would carry fire sticks. And as they would walk from one camping area to the next, they would carry fire. And as they literally spilled fire onto the landscape to keep their corridors nice and clean. And also good for hunting in case you're hungry and there's a moose up ahead or a muskrat. The Serengeti, and just again, very non-flammable landscape there, prairie meadows burning. And this points to the safety aspect too. Again, the Native Americans are not going to be messing around in unsafe conditions with fire. So from burning when it's a safe time to burn was part of that culture. Okay, so this is kind of what we learned from first of all their fires were very strategic. Where they burned, when they burned, and what they burned for, highly strategic. They burn when it was safe. Oftentimes, if you read through these materials, they're burning when it's higher humidity, like really early spring or really late fall, when as soon as the sun goes down, the humidities come up and a lot of the grassland fires just go right out. You can't burn past 6 o'clock at night, even at this time of the year. When snow is still on the ground, so they could come in and do some of that snow burning. And again, like I said, at sunset, dew points would extinguish the fires, okay? So in our present day situation, what have we found out about fire that this is kind of interesting, just, making these predictions. And I was telling somebody just the other day that I was out paddling up in the Mountie waters last fall and fall, and I was sitting out there in Lake 3, I think it was, where the Pamagi Creek fire had burned over the site. And I'm looking up there and I'm like, oh my God, it's like perfect moose habitat. And I remember reading that the best grizzly bear habitat is 10 years after a fire to 40 years after a fire. And this is in Glacier National Park. And I'm looking at it, it's all full of asters and willows and young aspen growing and grasses like crazy, super diverse grasses up in the Mountie waters. More so maybe even down here in our grassland area, which makes me question was it really a forest or was it more of a pine savanna up in that area? But anyways, as I'm looking at this, I'm like thinking, then I think this, before humans were here with guns and traps, this fire started from lightning, burned off this area, would attract the moose would have more moose, the caribou were there at that time, I'm going back before guns and traps, the caribou were there, the deer, the bear, the snowshoe hares, the mice, the voles, all these herbivore populations would benefit from this. And they would start eating down the willows and eating down the aspens and nipping off some of the pines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they would hold it in this disequilibrium, in this early successional stage. And that's where you maximize all your power, diversity, et cetera, and ecosystem function and the provision of ecosystem services. And so can you slowly but surely, if something came like starvation, then the trees would get ahead and it would all go through that cycle again and would take a lightning strike to reset the whole situation. But they would hold it in that disequilibrium for a while until something else changed in that situation. Anyways, kind of interesting. So anyways, I read about the Pamagi Creek fire right now. It's the highest concentration of moose in the area, up to 7.6 moose per square mile Monkey time. And so they're all like, the researchers up in this area, Mulch, Fond du Lac Reservation, super excited about this. And he's talking about snowshoe hares and deer mice, decreases the ticks. We know that's a problem with the moose. And they're literally saying that moose can handle really heavy predator loads if they have quality forage. And I've been, being in Ely for a long time, it's like, how can a moose even walk through this stuff? I can't walk through it. And so I've been for a long time saying this is just not moose habitat. And so the fire has helped recreate the moose habitat. There's Pamagi Creek right there, fire. It started in like July, and finally it blew up in October, and we went and put it out. But 10 or 15 miles southeast of Ely, 90,000 acres. Just some pictures of flying over this area right now. Okay, so let's talk about carbon and the benefits of burning with carbon. There's a lot of people that are talking about carbon being burned off from this fire is going in the atmosphere and not being a good thing. And again, we have to look at that uh, principle of counterintuitive. And we have to think that there's this pulse of carbon that goes in the atmosphere, but the long-term benefits to grassland ecosystems that put so much carbon into the soils, it's a slower sink, but it's a forever sink. And we need to deal with those long-term, those slow variables and not the quick pulse of fire like that. We need to be thinking these deep down sources and sinks in the long term. Isn't that a beautiful patchy fire down there? I mean, that's exactly what we're shooting for. This. I was just reading a paper, again, from UC Davis and Lipset and Moore, and they're literally talking about this type of food production in agroecology or silvopasture or silver savanna culture. Literally, if it's done correctly, would be the equivalent of annually taking 19 million cars off the road. So this is some forward thinking. And no, we need these ecosystems. I was just at a meeting last night and they're talking about all these other ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere. And I'm like, what about restoration? Restoring functional ecosystems that did this probably better than anything else. In the Savannah talk tomorrow, we'll talk about probably it was the relationship between grazing animals and these grasslands that caused the ice ages. Pretty cool concept. We know that our mulch soils were formed underneath grasslands. We know the mulch soils are the most fertile soils on Earth. We know that the mulch soils sequester more carbon than any other type of soils in the world. Look at the color of those dark soils right there. That's the carbon in the soil. So how did they do that? We know that part of that relationship is grazing animals. They eat the top off the grass. The grass cannot support the roots anymore. The roots shed down into the soils, long-term burial, till the next glacier comes along, that carbon's trapped in the ground. But what about the role of fire in doing this? So here's a picture from 2 years ago where we did do some pollinator. This is where we cut out those big giant circles, like 30-acre circles in this site. And just in the exact same site, these two pictures are taken about 6 feet apart. And I just wanted to show you the difference between the burn site and the non-burn site from a distance. You know, I'm 5.5 feet in the air where I take this picture, and that's a dime on the ground. Non-burned, you can see in the burned area. Look at this, we're 6 feet apart, and we just look at the diversity. I think this is more sunlight dependent than anything, that the sun has come in and maybe there's some purple prairie clover there that just hadn't been doing very well. Oh my God, it's sunlight. And maybe a chemical does come out of the burn, the smoke, the charcoal that stimulates it to grow. We have sun, we can do it. But also notice the seedlings deep inside. This is the non-burn site. Also look at the ground really closely. How much charcoal is there? It's pretty light, not charcoalized. Here's the burn site. And you can see all these little baby, that's bad, baby. These little seedling purple prairie clovers coming up here. And if you look really closely, the ground is darker and you can see little pieces of charcoal all over. If we did more frequent burning, less of the fuel would be consumed. And so we would charcoalize a lot more of these materials, creating literally, you know, when you charcoalize something, that carbon and nitrogen, that's what I'm always thinking about is nitrogen, but that carbon is tied up for, again, super, super long-term periods. So again, counterintuitive, we pulse this amount of carbon into the atmosphere, but the long-term storage that we're creating through charcoalization, biochar, and sloughing off those roots at below by taking off the tops of the vegetation should, in essence, in theory, from what we've seen in the past, create a massive sink of carbon down below that. So can we use this knowledge, this indigenous knowledge for intelligent design? Absolutely. And here we're burning in the Metro South area. This is when I was with Prairie Restorations and in a nice park. My people that do the burns with me, they want to charcoalize, they want to burn everything that they possibly can. So when I'm talking about burning out, cutting out this patch and burning when it's a little bit wetter and not as intensely, or burning every single year so we get trickling fires, they're just not as happy about burning like that. They want to do these big, powerful, raging fires. And so again, I think it's a lot of just a cultural thing, training ourselves. So here's something in your next burn plan to think about doing here. Just kind of a goofy little map here I made, but using this indigenous culture, can we burn in the oak groves up on the top left-hand corner, northwest corner in this site? Can we burn that in the fall when the leaves are falling on the ground, or really early in the spring when there's still snow maybe on the outside perimeters that will prevent the fire? Can we burn the riverbanks when it's literally at that point of in the wintertime when there's snow back in the grasses, and we just flush that right off, which will help stabilize the riverbanks immediately in the spring of the year by flushing out a new growth like that? In the pine groves, like the Native Americans up in the boreal systems, can we burn in early spring? Can we use the same patch over and over and over again to create lawns in certain areas and not let the fires burn beyond that? So we have both the woods, the forest, and these patches. And that's what the Cree and the Assiniboine seem to do. And in the prairie, can we burn in super early spring or very late fall? Again, when the moisture levels are up higher because it's just not that warm out anymore, where the sun's going down at 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock, the humidities come out and put those fires out. Can we start to burn these ways, okay? So I think we really can. And so next time we sit down and do burn plans, let's think about intelligent design. Let's think about indigenous design. Here's a site I burn every single year. This is up in Ely, and I just burn it every year. I think I have I want to say 125 native plants in the sun. We never planted one. It's just come right out of the seed bank. And we burn it every single year. Kind of like a neighbor, I burn everything I possibly can, twice a year if I can burn. And there it is. There's the fire in the background. Super low intensity burn. And the columbine in the foreground has been burned here just a little bit. Here's another site in Scott County, Minnesota. This was a site where I didn't even know if the owner of the site, the manager of the site, would even pay for us because it was such a patchy burn. But again, in this case, the manager of these lands were like, oh my God, that's what we should be shooting for in the future. Awesome, it looks beautiful. I like this a lot. And so again, it's just a way that we can see differently like that. But you land managers that are sitting out there in the audience right now, you can help us. This can be really expensive to mow out these certain zones and et cetera, and defend circles on fire breaks. Can you imagine that? It works well in this direction, but as soon as the fire comes around the other side of the circle, we've got problems, So it's really difficult. So land managers, whether you're public or private, please help us install fire in this way by maintaining breaks through the year. I don't know if it's a ski trail, a hiking trail, or mow it 2 or 3 times. That would be help. Ordinances. We are so crippled by a lot of ordinances in counties that as soon as the sun goes down, everything has to be out, or we cannot leave a fire, even if there's one piece of wood in the middle of 5 acres that's still smoldering, completely black around it. There's no way. We have to put all that out. And so the hours add up and the hours add up. And to us, it seems like completely ridiculous. But can you work with your county ordinances so we can make fire more realistic than that? Your RFQs that we receive to do these services, start listing things like our goal is to achieve 50%, between 70% and 50% reduction. Do not exceed 71% reduction in fuel loads, and please try to capture at least 50%. So yeah, be dynamic and be flexible about these burning plans like that. So fire, good or bad? Rare species carbon sequestration. Maybe the question should really be, is the way we do fire good or bad? And can we do it better if we can? Can we restore those historic fire regimes? And I think after that, that's about all I have. And great. Nothing more, okay? So thanks a lot, guys.